I'm Elsie. I am a native New Yorker. I was born in Queens, went to high school on the Upper East Side at Hunter, a public school that I'm very proud of. Then I went to Yale, and I was a history of science, medicine, and public health major there. Graduated about 6 years ago. Right after that, I jumped into working for New York City's Economic Development Corporation on the life sciences team. Activate was then a $500 million initiative, now a $1 billion initiative to activate the life sciences ecosystem here in New York City. After that, I fell in love with biotech, said, what do I want to do next? And now I'm at Stern Investor Relations, where a biotech-focused investor relations firm working with private and mid-cap biotech companies around the world.
Hi everyone, I'm really honored to be here. My name is Lydia. I was a LifeSci NYC intern in 2020, and I was a curator. I'm originally from Boston, and I went to Columbia where I studied medical humanities, which is kind of a combination of like public health, bio, comparative literature. After that, I took a year to do clinical research coordinating at Jacobi Medical Center, and I'm now at Mount Sinai, and I'm a data coordinator for clinical research, and I'm excited to see where the future takes me in the life sciences.
This is an easy question, but maybe I'll start with Lydia first. Why did you choose to start your career in life sciences in New York versus going back to Boston?
Actually, a lot of people have asked me that because Boston is pretty well known for the life sciences field, but I felt like I honestly had really great roots here in New York City because I got to college here, and then also largely because of this program. I felt like I had a really large network of peers and also people that I had worked with in the past, and I had other internship experiences here in New York as well. So I really felt like I had really great roots in New York City, and I also felt this passion that the city had for really emphasizing young people getting into this field. It felt really up and coming in New York City versus in Boston. So it was really exciting to be a part of it as a young person, so I decided to stay in New York as opposed to going back to Boston.
Yeah, I can do that. So I'm a through and through New Yorker. I got my New York apartment before I got a job to share with my parents quite quickly, so that's not necessarily the best role model in some ways. But I did learn a lot about the biotech ecosystem when I actually started working in biotech in New York. So when I was at the EDC, a lot of what I learned was how amazing all of the talent and all of the innovations are that are coming right out of the medical centers here. So we've got Columbia, we've got Mount Sinai, we've got a whole host, Montefiore, SUNY Downstate, all of these amazing scientists that are creating innovations every day. A lot of that science actually leaves and goes to Boston, San Diego, other hubs around the world. And a big part of my job at EDC was keeping them there, growing talent like you guys. And now that I'm on the investor relations side and more sort of finance oriented, I've actually realized even more of a totally different angle actually with the value of being in New York and biotech specifically, because my clients are all over the world. I have clients in London, I have clients in the West Coast, Boston, etc. And they all come to New York. I see them face to face all the time because they come here for the banking services, the investors that are here, the other companies. A lot of executives actually, funny enough, live in Manhattan or even across the river in New Jersey, but actually commute out. So that's been a really interesting takeaway, that we are very much a hub of life sciences talent in that way, and I'm proud to grow my career and keep doing that here.
Great. So if Nico and Joe haven't already sold you on being here in New York City, and you all have jobs here in New York City, I think these two can do an excellent job of convincing you to stay here as well. So this talk is a little bit less. The last talk was about their internship and their preparing for getting that full-time offer. I intentionally wanted this talk to be a little bit different. This is about feedback in the workplace. Now, these two have impeccable credentials, and they've already shared some of those with you. But I'm going to first ask you about how much science do you actually do in your daily job? You both shared that you had some science in your major. How much does that factor in on a day-to-day basis right now?
So that's a really great question. I'm a data coordinator specifically within clinical research, and I'm a program coordinator for one specific type of cardiac intervention that is handled at Mount Sinai. And so my job is really, really technical in certain elements, but because I only have an undergraduate education, there's only so much that I can do in terms of understanding that technical background. And so a lot of my job really does emphasize focusing on communication and learning. So I would say it's a good 50-50 split of understanding the technical jargon and being able to have and use that scientific knowledge and background. But I think a really large part of my job is really emphasizes communication, because I really do need to be able to communicate with the actual interventionists and the other people in clinical research who I handle the clinical data for. And so I would say it's a pretty 50-50 even split for me.
I'm a little further from the science than you are, Lydia. I actually don't have any sort of hard science background whatsoever. But a lot of the science that I do work on a day-to-day basis is really translating what my company's management teams and their science teams have done in the lab and making those understandable. So doing great science is one thing, having someone pay for it and get that to the market is a whole other thing. So part of my job is really using the communication skills and my understanding of the science to really bridge that gap, to make sure that people understand what the people in the lab are doing, are willing to put extra dollars in, and also get them from the A, B to the C rounds, and eventually down to commercialization.
So could you share, well, tomorrow we'll have a couple panels on entrepreneurship. So I hope you all come back tomorrow. We've got intellectual property, we've got 2 panels on entrepreneurship. Just to double click into what you said, you talked about some funding. I think you may have said Series A or B. Could you just explain briefly roughly what that means?
Yeah, so in very short order, those are just different steps of company growth. So to make it very basic, it's as you grow, you need an A round. Then as soon as you sort of hit a couple of milestones, whether that be initial proof of concept, for example, then you can say, okay, I'm ready to raise a B to get me to the next step, and say that's a phase 1 clinical trial now in the clinic, and then now you say, all right, I need another B round, a C round, et cetera, to really grow my company, build out some lab space, hire my 25th, 100th employees. So that's really what that gets you, with the idea is that if the company strategy looks like that, then you would eventually make it onto the public markets and beyond, kind of like a Moderna or a BioNTech.
Thank you. So communication, you both mentioned communication, and I also want to shift into leadership. But what does communicating on your job look like? Does that mean giving formal presentations? Does that mean manage updates to your manager? Does that mean speaking to external clients or customers or other people in the organization, other stakeholders?
So for me, it's a combination of both that really largely focuses on kind of the internal. So to give a bit of background on my job, I handle 1 procedure, as I mentioned, and on a monthly basis, I do a presentation to the actual interventionist. So I'm the only person who manages that specific procedure and the research that we handle for it. So I'm really the only person who's able to see the way patients are actually recovering, the way patients are reacting to this procedure, what's going on afterwards. So I'm the one who's following up with the patients and speaking to them on a daily basis and handling the follow-ups. And then I'm also the person who kind of liaises that over to the actual interventionist to say, these are the mistakes that happen, these are some of the quality control concerns, these are some questions that patients are having. And so a part of that is presenting and communicating that in a very formal manner, but a lot of it is also communicating to the interventionist on a daily basis in order to make sure I'm keeping up to date with what's going on, any updates in terms of the types of data that we need to handle, and the types of data that is being analyzed, and then I'm the person who analyzes that and communicates that. So it's largely internal, but I am kind of client-facing in a sense, if you consider the patient's clients. So it's a combination for me.
Just to clarify, you said the interventionist. Can you explain who that is, what type of role they are? That's all physicians, others?
So the interventionists are cardiologists, so they're cardiac interventionists, but as everyone I'm sure is aware, medicine is very complicated and it's a team project, so there's also nurses, nurse practitioners, everyone in between. And so I do communicate with a lot of different people, but I would say mainly with cardiac interventionists.
Yeah, so in my role specifically, I think communication and leadership are very diverse. So I both manage internal teams, and then I also report upwards internally, and then I also report in some ways both upwards and laterally to the management teams of my clients. So there are a lot of different dimensions that I think also are applicable at all levels that I think I've taken from my early days too, as an intern or a first year entry into the workplace type. A lot of that is questions like, what do I know? How do I best get this across the finish line? And how do I help other people do their jobs? And also, how do the people that I'm talking to, how can they help me do their job, right? So those are the types of questions that I have to ask myself a lot when it comes to how do I distill my knowledge and communication style and leadership and adjust that in a way that's applicable to that particular scenario.
So I want to shift now a little bit into feedback. So your interns, this may be the first job that you've had, maybe you've had other professional or career leading jobs, maybe not. One of the things that we'll talk about later in the summer is asking for feedback and then acting on feedback. So I'm going to ask both of you, what's the best model of feedback that you've ever experienced in the workplace? And what did that look like? Did someone deliver it? How did they do it? We can get into the details in a little bit, but maybe you want to describe the best model of feedback. And if it is that your current work environment doesn't have a great model, that's okay. You can share what your past, you don't have to share any of those details. Just pick a good model that you've experienced.
So I actually have an executive coach now, and I asked her for help on those questions. I'm going to whip out my phone and pull up my notes. Because she gave me a really good feedback framework that I actually have used myself and also have been the recipient of, but never really thought about it quite so concisely. And she said that the framework can be described as acknowledge, communicate, and then provide options. Meaning, let's start out by acknowledging, and I think this is both a great way to both give feedback and also solicit feedback, right? So when you're giving feedback, you can say, I acknowledge that you maybe need to work a little bit more on your communication style, for example, right? Then you communicate that, you find a platform to actually do that, have a one-on-one, or message them and say, hey, can you jump on the phone, or talk to them in your office. And then you provide options, and providing options if you're giving feedback can be, so how do you think you can do better? Because if you're the recipient, you not just want to have recommendations shoveled down your throat, I think, but also it helps you sort of think through okay, this is what I'm hearing, and how do I get better? But you also are independently pushed to do that, right? And then it becomes a conversation where it's okay, those are good ideas, etc. I also think, at least in my perspective, that's a good way of receiving feedback. I realize I've been on the recipient end of that after I was personally taught this a couple of days ago. I find it really, really helpful because then I feel like both the person who's both giving feedback and the person who's receiving it are engaged in the process. It's not just a one-way street where you did all of this wrong, now go fix it. It's here's an area where you can improve, now let's think about how you can improve it together.
Yeah, I really value feedback. I think this is a really important question because I think feedback is one of the most important things in a position because you really have no idea how you're performing and how much assistance you're being to the people that you are answering to if you're not really getting feedback. I think my favorite form of feedback is when I have one person that I'm answering to directly and one person who I'm able to check in with. So for instance, I had this when I was at Curator. I also had it in my internship when I was at Pfizer a couple years back. And it was really great because in those positions I had one direct manager who also had a manager, and we all had very specific goals and specific streamlined ways that we did our work. And so it was all very organized, and that we had one-on-one meetings and we would do evaluations. I think evaluations are really important, and I think these are more common in more corporate settings. And I know evaluations can kind of be daunting sometimes going into it. You feel like they might just be pointing out all the things you're doing wrong. But I really do feel like it's a really important learning opportunity because if those things aren't pointed out to you, you're not progressing in your position. And I personally think the absolute worst thing that can happen to me in a position is becoming stagnant. So if you're not getting that feedback, I don't really feel like you're growing in the work that you're doing. And I think in my current position, it's not quite as streamlined in that way, so I have to seek out the feedback. But because I know that it's really important and I valued it in the past, I now have the tools to be able to really seek it out and to say, am I doing these things correctly? What can I improve? What am I lacking? And I think it's important to do this on a pretty regular basis. It obviously doesn't have to be exactly every month, every 2 weeks or something like that, but I think it's good to have someone to check in with regularly.
Something I've noticed about receiving feedback, or soliciting feedback rather, is, so I actually started my current job in the investor relations world during the pandemic. So I found it actually much easier to both receive and give feedback in the in-person world, because you just step out of a meeting and you look at your boss, and they, by default, you just start debriefing, and feedback comes up naturally in that setting in a really organic way. That doesn't happen in the virtual world. So something I actually struggled with when I was transitioning into a new role, not totally, but a semi-adjacent but different industry at the same time, was how do I get that, right? So there was a little bit of a mental gap when I first started that said, oh, Elsie, you need to Slack that person and ask, how did I get in that meeting? Or you need to make a point next time you're in the office to say, oh, remember that meeting yesterday? What could have gone better, right? So I think that's something I would highly encourage all of you guys, especially if you are in some sort of hybrid or remote internship or role down the line, to really, really think and push yourself to take that step of hammering out that message or like asking someone to get on the phone.
So just to offer you a little bit of a framework for feedback, Elsie shared some great questions. May even come back to you to repeat those. You're going to do an internship. I recommend that you ask for feedback at least at the midpoint of your summer internship. How am I doing? Who was the mayor? Who always asked that? Ed Koch. He would walk up to people, mayor of New York, and just say, how am I doing? He was always asking for feedback. So you can ask for feedback midway during your internship. You can make it a little bit more structured because your internship is 8, 10, max 12 weeks. So you can do it on a little bit more of a regular basis. Here's what I recommend. Have something around, here are 3 things that I think I'm doing well. Here are 3 things I think I can improve on. Then ask your manager, what do you think? It gives them something to react to. I'm curious what's been your experience with positive feedback in the workplace? Because feedback is not all negative, hopefully. Have you had experience?
I had really, really positive feedback that was really uplifting when I was at Curator. I think that was some of the most important positive feedback that I ever received in my life, because I realized I have certain strengths that I didn't even recognize. And so to have those seen by other people that I didn't even see in myself was really important. And so I'm really grateful for that. And to this day, I go back and I read some of those memos, and they're really important to me. And so even if you don't seek it out, sometimes it can be unexpected. But everyone has strengths that they may not even recognize in themselves.
Yeah, I will concur with that. Actually, my old boss and many of the people in this room know back at the EDC gave me a very great positive feedback, actually in that same format, right, in a structured annual review. And at that point, you've done something a year ago that at least I had totally forgotten about, but he actually wrote about my review, had really great things to say, and that was super uplifting, right? The fact that someone actually thought about what you did several months ago, put the time into writing that on paper and sharing that was really helpful. And I think also as you grow in your career, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes it's easy to get bogged down by the weaknesses, right? So whenever you have that note, right, that written memo, or even the recollection of having that shared, it's really nice to lean on and say, okay, this is a strength I have that I can grow from.
And also to add to that, I think it's really important also not to minimize these things. People aren't going out of their way to say something positive about you just to be nice. In a professional setting, I think it's important to really actually internalize those things. And I didn't even realize that when I was at Curator, and I continue to think about the things that were pointed out to me, and I continue to kind of internalize them and think about the ways in which I can apply them to my career now. And I think it's really important. And I think it's also really important to be writing all of these things and keeping track of the positive and the negative, of course, and just having a way to remember the feedback that you're receiving has also been really important to me.
I love what you were saying, that you have kept track of it. One of my fellow coaches said she keeps a kudos folder, so anytime somebody says something nice about her, she just saves it in some folder on a desktop, laptop, I don't know where, email folder. So that's one thing to do, because if you're having a bad day, sometimes it's nice to go back to something a little kind and positive. What advice would you give to interns who are entering, for the most part, their first job?
I would say, just going back to my comment earlier about breaking out of the virtual environment, don't be afraid to ask questions. That bogged me down a little bit when I started my first job, my first virtual job, right, let's call it that. That was a struggle for me, and I had to work through it, and it was something great. And also just asking questions. I jumped from the economic development corporation world of biotech into the finance investor relations world of biotech, and there was so much I didn't know about the capital markets, about the role stakeholders play, and how everybody fit in. I right now actually have my very first commercial stage client company. There are tons of questions I have for their CEO, for my colleagues, right? Don't be afraid to ask those questions. As long as you are engaged and sharp, people appreciate that, and most importantly, you're learning.
Yeah, I took a second there to think about how I wanted to word this because I think it's kind of a difficult thing to communicate, but I would say I think it's really important to kind of strike a balance between humility and confidence. Obviously, you don't want to go into something and be super, super nervous and not really speak up, but at the same time, you don't want to be overly confident and not asking questions and acting like you know everything that's going on, because ultimately you really don't in your first position. So I think it's a really important balance of being comfortable enough to ask questions like that, and that takes an element of confidence as well. I also think it's really important to have an ally that you can practice this with, and finding allies within the workspace. Having coffee chats and one-on-ones. I think most people are surprised by how willing other people are to talk about their jobs and the things that they do, even if they're not on the team that you work on or specifically in the same kind of area. I think most people are really willing to speak, especially to interns, to talk about the career trajectory that they've had, the work that they do. I think you can find out really interesting and important things about your own career by speaking to other people and finding other perspectives. So I would say it's all about kind of striking that balance, and if you're someone who has a hard time speaking up and asking questions and things like that, I read one time, and I've always applied this and it's been really helpful to me, I read one time that if you're in a meeting or you're in a space that you're unfamiliar with, if you kind of push yourself to say something within the first 15 minutes, of course if it's appropriate and you have a role where you're speaking in that space, if you push yourself to say something within the first 15 minutes, you're like 50% more likely to speak for the rest of the meeting. So I've always applied that personally, and I've always found it a lot more helpful. If I've said at least one word within the first 15 minutes, I find that I'm speaking up a bit more and I'm a lot more comfortable asking questions and things like that. So that may be a helpful tidbit.
Two other areas that came to mind as you were speaking. When it comes to one-on-ones, totally agree. Always ask people for questions, and also ask people for time. Like, how did you get where you are? Like, what do you do? What do you like about what you do? Like, how do I get where you are potentially? People are so open to doing that. And also, I would highly encourage doing those in person. Virtual Zoom is easy to forget about. I have met so many people over Zoom that I, quite frankly, might struggle to remember again, right? But when you meet someone in person, sit down with them over a coffee at Starbucks or wherever, people just really get a sense of who you are, you get a better sense of who they are, and people just feel more comfortable and memorable at the end of the day, which leads to my second point around relationships. I know I had a hard time recognizing this per se, like maybe early in my career, but as my career evolves, I realize how important those relationships are. I am 6-7 years out of school. I still have many of the relationships. I think actually, Anita, I met you maybe in my first year out of school, quite frankly, and here we are 7 years later, right? The people they meet through your internship, whether you hate the industry and want to move on or love it, right? Those people will be there to support you, grow you, and also teach you over the long term. Careers are very, very long. We're all going to be working for quite some time, but also learning for quite some time, right? So maybe the person in finance that you met in your internship while you were, at the bench was someone who's really interesting and engaging, and maybe in 5 years you decide you want to do something similar and you can tap on them, right? Don't lose track of that and say that.
Fantastic tips. Thank you. And to see if we have time. We have time for one question from the audience. Would anyone like to ask either Elsie, Lydia, or both a question? Yes.
Yeah, my question is, how exactly would you approach your supervisor for like a one-on-one to get like feedback? So I know you said that there's not always a structured feedback system at your position or job. So how exactly would you approach your supervisor? How would you recommend that?
So that's a really great question because obviously office to office and person to person is really distinct. I think it's important first to be really observant about the environment that you're in and your supervisor and the way that they communicate. I think once you learn the way that they really appreciate being approached and being spoken to, then you can kind of play into that. So maybe if you're in your office, it's more normal to use Slack, or it's more normal to email, or maybe your supervisor is someone who is more in person and they would appreciate for you to walk up to them. I think it's all about really being observant and then applying what you observe. And I think it can be really person to person, so kind of using those observation skills and then applying that specifically to the supervisor that you have, and just saying something like, I would love to connect, I would really appreciate some feedback, anything along those lines. I think they would really appreciate, and I think most of the time they'll be like, oh yeah, great, I would love to do that as well.
No, that was great. My only one suggestion is just maybe giving someone just a day or two and saying, hey, like, would love to get a coffee to, chat, get some feedback on how I've been doing, and then making sure that they have that day or two just to actually sit and think about it, so they're giving you the best quality feedback they can.